Here, I'll give you a lift. Shit! Get inside! Artyom, ahead!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Spoiled Games. Let's just get something out on the table yet again. We're going to be talking about Metro Last Light, and there's a reason it's called Spoiled Games. We are going to spoil the game. We're going to talk about it. It's really intended if you played it and you'd like to get part of a larger, deeper, richer discussion. If you plan on finishing it, stop now, go play it, and then come back. You'll appreciate this all the more. And here to talk about Metro Last Light, we have Klepek, Senior News Editor at GiantBomb.com. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And
Tara Long of Rev3 Games.
Hello.
So, Metro, the original, was a game that I greatly admired. I think many, many people did. But it was easier to admire than sometimes to sort of appreciate just as a game due to some of the qualities that were a little bit, I'd say, rough around the edges in terms of that. But I have to say, in terms of just even the, 3-4 years since that came out, this is a polished game by any standard of any AAA game coming from any country.
Yeah, I mean, Metro 2033, the gunplay was just pretty mediocre. And I'm of two minds of that, right? Like, I'm a huge fan of Far Cry 2. Like, I kind of like it when games disempower the player, and sometimes what appear shoddy mechanics are actually just ways of making it perhaps more immersive, where you can align yourself as a player that's just not very powerful in a world. And in the Metro games, like, you're not supposed to be a superhero. Like, you are just kind of like this crappy dude, just kind of like bumbling along. But it also, what ends up happening when you have games like that is that it turns off a lot of players. So getting people to enjoy Metro 2033, they'd get around to the gun combat and be like, you know what, I can go play games where the shooting feels a lot better. And whereas in Last Light, it retains a lot of the atmosphere and the grit and the weirdness of 2033, but the gunplay is just so much better, so it just makes the whole series palatable to, I think, a wider audience, which makes me excited because, like, there's just so many weird things happening in these games that excite me, and the better gunplay just makes it appeal to just a wider audience.
I mean, as we've talked about, I mean, there's so much to the mood and to the story that the idea that you're going to have the core mechanic get in the way of a reasonable person playing the game to completion. I mean, I definitely found that Last Light wanted me to finish it and to see everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the atmosphere and the environments and everything is the most compelling part of both games. I will say that the first game was incredibly challenging, and I didn't think it was always in the fairest way possible. But the second one kind of went in the opposite direction. So I guess it really depends on your taste. Like, if you're more into survival horror stuff, you definitely enjoy the first one. The second one, you know, the gunplay isn't like excellent or anything, but it's like steps ahead of the first one, and everything else is just amazing about it.
And the guns tend to get from those sort of bootstrapped, duct-taped, strange-looking things into more contemporary, or I guess not for them contemporary weapons, but you know, the AK-47s of the times gone by. With that in mind, let's get to the story for a second. Even with the first Metro, one of the things that's always kind of I found so fascinating is it doesn't go into that much detail about the circumstances that have driven, you know, the last residents of Moscow into the subway. I mean, World War II went in a different direction. Bombs fell from the sky. I mean, I kind of find it fascinating that there's a sense of mystery and that you really just plop down right into the circumstance.
I mean, when I, at PAX East, I had a chance to talk to the original author of 2033, Dmitry, insert rest of name I cannot pronounce. Fascinating character, and we talked at length about that specific bit, and he there is no explanation for why the world the way it is, because he doesn't find that part interesting, right? Like, the politics of why the bombs dropped, sort of irrelevant, especially to the people that have been driven underground. Like, the politics of what caused that, they just have to worry about surviving. And I think that's what makes Metro like really fascinating as a place, is it doesn't concern itself with how we got here. It's more just the human reality of how you get to the next step of just surviving, as it seems like the rest of the world, especially the surface, is evolving ahead of you. And that's like a big question in Last Light, is these creatures that have emerged, the Dark Ones, like, are they just a natural evolution of history where we've wiped ourselves off the map, and these Dark Ones who can survive on the surface, they can they don't all the irradiation doesn't affect them. Like, I think that's an interesting question that Last Light explores about maybe humanity's time is just up. Like, you just kind of last as long as you can, but the Dark Ones are superior in every way possible, So maybe we're just not meant to be around anymore.
Yeah, it's not that the Earth is wiped out. No, mankind is getting wiped out, and there's some evolution there. I do find it fascinating that when you look at the political dynamics in the Metro, and here you have these people that are somehow hewing to Soviet ideals, and you have people who are hewing to these fascist ideals, and you end Metro with pretty much eradicating, committing genocide on this new species. And here you have these other political dynamics that have also, in actual history, have practiced the same art of just trying to wiping people off the earth. I mean, I didn't know if you got into that sort of commentary.
I did, and that's one thing that I preferred about this one than the previous one, because they didn't really go into a whole lot of the interhuman conflict there. It was more, I guess, about the supernatural things and Artyom himself. And here I feel like the whole supernatural aspect of the storyline couldn't have survived if they did go into that background about what happened. And I've heard that that's sort of a complaint about the book as well, is that there wasn't a whole lot of backstory there, which I like, because I think everything is sort of mysterious now, and it works better than it did before. And the whole arguing political factions thing, I mean, I tend to get a little fatigued with political World War II era stuff like that, but for me, something about this one really gripped me.
And I've noticed this with also sort of The Witcher and a lot of the Eastern European games. The morality is a lot more dubious. Yeah, everyone's really bad, but it's not sort of you're worse than that guy. They all seem to have, I guess, their moments in the sun to just show how just horrible they all are.
Yeah, I mean, you have in the Metro universe these competing ideologies, and what's kind of fascinating is how it explores, at least to some degree, tries to give you some truth to why each of these, you would have people that were following these different ideologies. You have these sort of contemporary Nazis, and you have this contemporary communism, socialism, and the competing ideologies. You can kind of they all get sort of wrecked by the individuals who are using them for really horrible means. But it does make sense that in sort of this irradiated, mutated humanity, in which there are mutated versions of society, that you would try and maintain normalcy. And so that's what the Nazis do in Metro Last Light, is they're using measurements to figure out whether you are a normal human or not. Now the people who are using that are using it not to the purest utopian sense of what that should be.
It invokes things that actually happened in Hitler's Germany.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating on the meta level of where this was developed, right? Because the viewpoint we come at it from is this Western Nazis bad sort of thing, and obviously that's certainly a shared worldview, but it's interesting to watch how they portray it, given that their viewpoint on that piece of history is just informed completely differently from where they grew up, how that was taught to them. I don't have that sense, and Last Light is still a little kind of blunt about Nazis are bad, like Western games can be. But when you think about it in the colored light of this was made in Ukraine, it casts a really interesting tone on it.
It definitely does. I mean, you don't get the same kind of easy shorthand of pure evil. Yeah. I think a lot of Western, not just video games, but other media like to cast Nazis in. And here it's almost sort of a practical evil necessity that you just have to put up with. I think that's just one of the parts about the game I just find so fascinating, is it is so sort of point blank about sort of the circumstances, and I guess the sense of endurance that a lot of these characters have to just live in these environments, where I think that if you'd had more of a Western take on it, there'd be more histrionics. They just seem to be all right, yeah, we're in the subway, there's monsters, let's go with it.
Yeah, I mean, like he was saying, I do think putting everything in the context of a post-apocalyptic scenario does sort of change the tone of that a little bit. People are going to be obviously more desperate than they were before, but also, it's just kind of about the evil of man. That, I think that's just one of the themes of the game, is how people get desperate and do things that are horrible and terrible, and they can get away with it because humanity is essentially gone.
And somehow it's made into a fine piece of entertainment.
Yeah.
as we go explore the darker recesses of human nature. I mean, one of the things that was very evident in the first Metro, I think was really effective in this one, is that sense of pace. You're moving from these different places, and you suddenly get into one of the stations, and Venice is the one that just stands out in my head as just kind of being. It was this act of imagination where okay, yeah, you actually have canals, but it's really canals probably of irradiated water that you've just turned into this strange evocation of one of the most beautiful cities on earth. I mean, I just love those moments of discovery, and the game just slows down and lets you kind of appreciate it. You don't see that much in Western games.
No, I mean, like, that's actually, it's one of the things that Metro doesn't get enough credit for, but people loved about a game like BioShock Infinite, where, like, there's this dynamic between, like, the intense combat and then these moments of, like, deep exposition, but exposition only if the player chooses to engage in it, right? Like, you can just run through those sections in Metro 2033 and in Last Light and not listen to all the idle conversations and kind of pick up on the smaller stories or try and get the kid his teddy bear, like if you guys
Where
did
was
that.
the teddy bear? I went looking for this.
I never found it.
So the teddy bear is if there was like a little mini game you could do where you could shoot the rats.
Yeah.
So if you did all of those, like there are an increasing number of challenges.
Teddy bear.
Then like the gift you get a bunch of money that you're betting up front to do the mini games, and at the end you get the teddy bear, which there's no you get an achievement for it, but you don't get anything of value from it. It's not like the
No, it's
mother,
like your ending
the
changes
mother,
or something.
The ending doesn't change, and the mother doesn't go like, and here's a super gun. You know, like that's how most games would handle it. And even tying an achievement to it, I found kind of distasteful, because what I love about a lot of those moments in both the Metro games is that you can be, like when you're giving money to like the homeless equivalent, even though it seems like everyone's homeless in Metro, but like there are people that are beggars asking for your military grade bullets, which is basically your money in the game. You don't get anything in return, at least as far as I can tell, for giving them that. It's more just, do you choose to engage with it? You don't get an achievement for that. You get an achievement for finding the teddy bear, but you don't get any sort of, like, it's not like you're going to be better at the game because you engage with this. It's purely just like an altruistic act in the game that the player can or can't kind of play around with.
Makes you feel good.
I think the other piece of interaction, which I inadvertently had to sit through twice, was when you are offered a lap dance.
Yeah, I had to do that twice too.
And I did not mean to have it a second time, and here I am sitting at home.
I did
My
the exact
wife's
same thing.
patiently typing behind me. I'm like, don't turn around, it'd be hard to explain. And it's kind of plastic and creepy also, that entire experience. Talking about sort of the bullets and the shooting that was in Venice, I mean, there is a lot more action, and I think the flip of the pacing is none of the combat sequences actually struck me as lasting longer than it needed to, which I think was something I found in 2033, but something I find in, I don't know how many games that are out there, that there seems to be a great deal of discipline of knowing how much you can engage the player before it just becomes sort of repetitive or filler, just to kind of justify the $60 purchase. Yeah,
it seems like what's interesting about the systems of Metro is that when you find yourself in the few sequences where it is sort of like a protracted combat where it's just waves and waves of enemies, they're basically pushing you, we're going to try and make you spend your money, right? Like, we're going to try and make you use your military grade bullets. And basically, you're just shooting cash out of a gun at that point. Like, which is such that just would not appear in a Western game. Like, that would just get focus tested out, like, for probably kind of smart reasons. But like, it's, again, one of the defining characteristics, I think, of the Metro games that I love about the few times when it does say, we're going to make you fight for the next 2 minutes, because if you haven't prepared correctly, if you've run out of ammunition, then suddenly you're going to be just dumping money into this gun, and it's terrifying.
Yeah, I feel like that's also probably a byproduct of the first game being a little bit more challenging and unfair, because I did die a lot of times. In the second one, I feel like there were probably just as many guys in a room, like say when you're fighting human enemies, for example, but it's a lot easier to go through it. And it's also, I found, interestingly, not as dark as the first game. I don't mean like...
You mean like, yeah, actually,
I
like
mean
the
like
lighting.
physically dark, yeah. And I didn't have my night goggles for the entire Metro Last Light because I thought there was a bug. Turns out it was actually just needing to be charged.
I never, because I saw the same thing in your review. I never even thought to use them because I
There's
actually
no
was able
tutorial
to see
for it, yeah.
pretty easily throughout the game. In addition, the stealth combat works, whereas in the first Metro, you're kind of throwing a knife at someone, really hoping that it's going to connect. And here, like you do seem to have more tools given over to you. It's almost like they know the limitations of the combat, and they need to give a little bit more breadth to the player, to keep the game interesting in all the combat sequences.
Well, yeah, the stealth I found pretty interesting because it's almost to a fault. Like, you can get away with murder as like you're like wandering around in front of enemies, because like it chooses to engage in a different level of sort of like system simulation, where like some games like Thief or Dishonored, like it gives you sort of indications that you can be seen or not seen, but like the general premise is like if you hide in a spot where you think you shouldn't be seen, you won't be seen. Whereas in Metro Last Light, like you have an indicator that's like either you can be seen or you can't. So you can be right in front of a dude crouching where it's like, this guy can see me. Yeah. But the game has tried to create this black and white scenario of like, we're not going to play in that level of simulation. We're instead just going to say you either are or aren't seen, and it's just, it doesn't It's not realistic, it doesn't make sense, but it's going to make the game more fun to play, and it allows you to be a little more risky with your stealth, and I never ended up finding those situations to be that frustrating, which stealth stuff can be when you think you're hiding, and in the game the guards like found you, and it's like, all right. Like in Metro, I never found that to be an issue.
I thought they actually did a really great job of doing that, where they just sort of put out like a music spike when you were getting close to being seen or something. So it's not like a visual indicator, but it still like makes you tense up when you hear
screwed.
it.
Yeah, there's always just that nice little chord. It's like, oh, that's the bad chord.
But I think if I remember correctly, you had time to like back off. Like
Yeah,
it didn't mean that like it's all over, pull out your gun and run.
It was like a warning, basically.
Now, having said that, is the game as scary as the first one? Because of its challenges in the first game, I felt there was a lot of tension, and there were some scary moments in Last Light. But I was trying to figure out if difficulty and that sense of anxiety have to kind of go hand in hand. 'Cause I did not find myself, especially in the latter half of the game, really kind of absorbing that sense of tension. Like, I don't know if I can get through this.
Yeah, I played it on normal and came out at the end of it wishing I'd played it on a harder difficulty setting, because one of the greatest pieces of tension in these games is when you go onto the surface and you have to change your air filter. And you have this countdown timer that is telling you, like, okay, you have like 7 minutes in reserve, but you need to swap this out to a new filter in order to keep going. By the end of the game, I had like 45 minutes on that filter. Like, maybe that's just like because I was scavenging around. Like, I had
the same thing.
And it was like, it killed like one of the key things I enjoyed about the surface dwelling was to have that sense of tension. So I know that the harder difficulties make the items more scarce, and so it's one of those things that early on in the game there's a bit of tension, but as you go along, if you're one of those people like me who plays like a Resident Evil, any survival horror game, I am just hoarding stuff. I don't want to use. And
the guy with all the sacks.
Yeah, and so it makes the beginnings of those games really, really fun and tense. But because of the way I play those games, they're not balanced to like force me to dump my stuff. So I end up having just like a full inventory full of rocket launchers at the end that I just haven't used by the final boss. So I'm curious that maybe if I get some more time this summer to go back and play it on a harder difficulty level. You know, Ranger mode is the one that everyone always says is sort of like the way to play the game.
Controversy is coming from it. It was in the marketing. He said the way to play the game, which of course is something you have to buy additionally with it. But we'll table that part for another time. The one extraneous story that I want to bring up before we go is something that came out from Jason Rubin, the former president of THQ during its final months, who acknowledged that the conditions under which this game was made were just far below anything you would expect to have at a Western dev studio, which I found the game quite impressive to begin with, but in light of that, I think it's quite astonishing. So, I mean, this is a polished game in every regard, and these guys were working on folding tables and chairs.
Yeah, I'm just floored by that, actually, especially since, you know, it's not just a game that works and is fun to play. It also looks amazingly beautiful, and those are small details that I imagine take a very long time to add to the game, and they nailed it.
There's a viciousness in some of that design, some of the details that I think, were it not as dark as it was, you would easily compare to BioShock Infinite in terms of just all the stuff there. But you know, a lot of it is lost in shadow. I mean, I know you spoke out publicly about sort of your amazement too about the conditions that they had to work in.
Yeah, I mean, and like, I don't want people to work in crappy conditions, but there is certainly truth to like the conditions you are in that they're in, that are different developers are in when they make a game, inform the game itself. So. Like, what I'm curious about is like how much of what they had to experience making the game actually informed the design. Like, I don't want to be like that to be extrapolated to like I want people to work in crappy conditions so I can get like weird, desperate, depressing games that are different than like a lot of the other stuff I play. But I would be curious what their perspective was on like, okay, obviously you should have like better conditions, but what did that mean for these games? Like, did that actually end up changing the way that you employ the mechanics or the way the storytelling happened as a result of, because you know, if you've seen Indie Game the movie or anything like that, the way that these games are made, the conditions they're made in, the stress that these people go through certainly comes through in the things that they make, and I wonder how much that is true of 4A games. But you know, on the same token, like I'd love to see what these guys did with a proper budget and backing. Like if this is with, because it's like they've proven what they can do with 10% of what the other people in their position get. Like what do these guys do when they're given like everything that they should be afforded.
And especially because they have imaginations. A lot of the people who worked on Metro also come from the Stalker team. Two of them, you can say whatever you want about the controls and everything, but the amount of imagination that goes into these products, I think, is so refreshing too, because it is a very unique take coming out of the former Soviet Union, obviously there in the Ukraine, in Kiev. Yeah, I agree. I want to see more from these guys, and I want to see more from them sooner, and I hope Deep Silver recognizes their value and gives them lots of money. Well, that's all the time that we have. Patrick Klepek, senior news editor, you wrote the review for Giant Bomb, and of course available at giantbomb.com, so go read it now and see if he's consistent with himself. And Tara, thank you so much for coming. I would give you a fonder farewell, but we're going to see each other only momentarily. That is it for this episode of Spoiled Games. We're going to have another one in 2 weeks. In the meantime, go watch other Spoiled Games of other games that you played. It could be Devil May Cry, or it could be something like BioShock Infinite. And we will have a new one in 2 weeks. We'll probably also deal with a desperate state of humanity trying to get by under horribly adverse conditions and stabbing things in the neck. What could I be talking about? Well, check out Spoiled Games in 2 weeks.